This is going to be a video about how to create value in a perspective drawing with chalk pastel. I did block in the major outlines on my paper, but they are hard to see in this video because I chose the brown paper to work with. While it's hard to see the initial outlines, I believe it actually helped create more contrast in the final drawing. As I continued getting ready for creating value in pastel, I unwrapped the pastels so paper from the wrapper doesn't get in the way and they are easier to use. I also turned my paper vertically as the composition I blocked in had outlines oriented vertically. After I unwrapped my pastels, I used a scrap piece of paper to make marks with my chosen pastels in order to see which of the pastels was lighter than another. I had them in the correct order, but you may have to reorder your pastels if you can't see that without marking on another paper. I normally suggest starting in the middle of a drawing and working your way outward to help reduce the amount of pastel I get on myself and parts of the drawing I need to keep clean. When I started creating value on my drawing, I used the largest side of the pastel to create marks first. The particular piece of pastel I used was already broken, so it wasn't very large, but I used the longest side. There are 3 techniques called line, stroke, and tone you should be aware of when working on any drawing. While using pastels, a line can be made with the corner, a stroke can be made with the part of the pastel that is similar to a pencil eraser, and tone can be created by using the longest side of the pastel while working. To be efficient with your time, using the tonal side as much as possible is important, so I started there first. I started close to the middle part of my drawing, but you could really start almost anywhere. I also started using the medium tone of my color scheme, which happened to be pink. Once I had the color filled in on the majority of the floor, I then used the lighter pink to create a value transition between the 2 colors. First, I used my fingers to blend the value. When I noticed it was getting all over my fingers, I tried using a tissue to blend, but then realized the tissue wiped off most of the pastel, so I went back to using 2 pastel colors and sometimes rubbing with my fingers to blend the colors together. Once I was satisfied with the floor, I went back to the medium pink and added that color to both the right and left walls in a vertical direction rather than the horizontal way I started the floor, so anyone looking at the drawing could see the difference between the walls and the floor. I tried to stay in my original outlines as best I could, but there were some areas where the pastel went over. I didn't let this bother me because I knew that another layer of pastel would probably cover the mistake I made as I continued to work. While I was working on the walls, I added a second lighter pink to again create a value transition where I could see the value on the original photo getting lighter. I also created a value transition above the lockers on the right wall where the wall is lighter on that side. Once that was done, I used the lightest pink to start value on the ceiling. I again used the medium pink to create a value transition where I could see the ceiling getting darker. As I was blending, I rubbed in diagonals so the marks were different from the walls. I then added white where the lights were on the ceiling in the direction I could see them going in the photo. I then went back to the floor and added the reflection of the lights into the floor with white. In order to blend that reflection in and create the impression of a reflection, I also added the darker pink to tone down the light reflection. Next, I started adding purple where the photo gets darkest. I used pieces of paper to prevent the purple from getting into areas I wanted to keep lighter. I also started to create darker areas in the walls and floor with the purple pastel, being careful to use only a little so the purple didn't overpower the pinks I was already using. Depending on what I was trying to create, the speed of my mark making changed. For example, when I create something smaller, I normally slow the speed of applying the pastel in order to make exact edges. There are 3 additional techniques called pressure, speed, and rhythm that an artist uses while creating any drawing, painting, or even sculpture in order to not only show value, but sometimes express thoughts and feelings or communicate an idea. We aren't quite there yet, but we will be soon. Sometimes as I would blend things with my fingers, I would rub too far and get lighter or darker marks in the wrong area. I didn't freak out, I just kept working, knowing I would work on fine-tuning those details later. Hopefully you also noticed that as I moved from one area to another to continue creating lights and darks in the drawing, I changed the mark-making directions between each plane or surface area. It's important to note here that I continued to work on all parts of the drawing. Once I was happy with the purple I was adding to the walls and floor, I started to develop the steps in the very middle of the drawing. To do this, I first added the lightest pink as the rectangular shape. I then moved to the medium pink in order to create the walls around the steps. Once the edges of those spaces were addressed, I started adding medium pink to the light pink rectangle to give that area the impression of steps. I then added purple to the short walls around the steps so your eyes could see those areas from the right and left walls. After I did this, I started to fine-tune the lines between areas using the line and stroke part of the pastel. I attempted to clean up edges between the walls and the ceiling, as well as the walls from the floor. I also utilized a ruler to make the door divisions in the middle of the drawing as accurate as possible. I lined up the inch marks on either side of the ruler in order to make the door lines and the reflections completely vertical. I continued to look at the photo to figure out where the divisions in the median of the door should be placed. Hopefully you noticed as I did this, I also blew the dust created from using the pastel off the drawing. I also rubbed lightly in a horizontal motion over the reflections to make them look like the buffed floor of the hallway. I also used the ruler to help true up the edges of the lights. Notice that I had to blend the light and medium pinks together to do this. I also did this in different areas of the walls and floor. You cannot completely finish one area of the drawing and move to the next thing thinking you will never come back to that area again. Products aren't made like that, whether it's a drawing, a piece of clothing, a piece of furniture, a house, or something else. In order to have a well-developed product, one has to continually go back and check how the parts of the object work with the whole. Eventually, I flipped the drawing upside down in order to put the black in the area that is at the top of the steps. Before I did this, I sprayed aerosol hairspray on my drawing to help set the chalk pastels so that if I bump my paper, the drawing doesn't disappear. When doing this, I sprayed about 1 foot away from the drawing. It's speckled a little bit, but I like knowing that most of my pastel will stay in place using the spray. I let that dry for a few minutes before moving on. Then I used a piece of paper to create an exact edge where the black was added to the upper part of the stairs. The paper created a resist, and flipping the paper upside down meant I didn't have to reach across the drawing as I worked. Sometimes I used 2 pieces of scrap paper to do this, depending on what part of the drawing I was working on. As I continued to fine-tune these areas, I noticed that the left wall and floor line didn't really match up. So I fixed that by moving the scrap paper to the corner and using the purple to add more value to the floor. Hopefully you noticed me placing the paper in that area a few times. What happened there is I was trying to figure out the best way to fix the problem. I did the same thing to the edges of the white lights that didn't have quite the correct diagonal line on the left side. Once I felt like I fixed that as best I could, I flipped the paper vertically again and signed the work in the lower right corner with my initials and the year. Looking back at it, there are a few things I would change. I really should have added a little more black at the top of the stairs and perhaps a little purple in the stairs themselves in order to unify the drawing a bit more. I also still don't really like the lights. I think the diagonals are still off. but it was the best I could do right now. I am pleased with the overall piece, and I do feel I did a pretty good job representing the value changes in the walls and floor. Additionally, the use of pink, purple, white, and black in each wall, floor, and ceiling helped keep the entire piece unified.
Not bad. 17 minutes so far.